I came upon all of this very accidentally. I was busy working for the last decade with the pharmaceutical industry, payers, regulators, patients, physicians, the whole healthcare stakeholder system in Europe, looking at a simple question. How do we get the right medicine to the right people at the right time, and oh yes, at the right cost? And had the privilege of working with the European Medicines Agency, a variety of different stakeholder groups, and really pushing hard on that difficult to define word that came up about value. So that was my life, and I was doing fine. In 2012, we had a family challenge with OCD and depression. And thank you, Bill. And that challenge led us into a path of traditional psychiatry, area we had not been familiar with before, despite my early training. And it led us into looking at some traditional psychiatric medicines, and it turned out that my son had a profound adverse reaction, and my wife is a physician, health researcher, and so she did what any mom would do, is kind of research and research and research at night. I woke up one morning and she came up to me in February 2013 and said, I just read this article by Moreno on OCD and psilocybin, and it looked really interesting. You were in the 70s? So I started doing what I do and connecting people and connecting with people, and started looking at this research and met most of the researchers, and we were really on a quest, because in all my professional work we really saw that a lot of the challenges of traditional medicines and psychiatry are difficult. Side effect profiles, compounds, prescribing, and so forth, and really difficult. And sometimes they only work for about 30% of the people in the SSRI antidepressant class. So maybe we need a new model. And so with that background, we started to fund this area of research and get much more interested in this question of papers are wonderful, but what about patients? It just happened coincidentally to be involved in that whole path of how you take an idea, a research, a promising medicine to patients. So we started a process of really looking at, well, let's look at these data that are coming out. Let's really push on them. Let's look at them, and let's go talk to the people who will actually talk about this path to patients. And so we've been working with researchers. We're focused, I live in London, we focus a lot of our time and energy in Europe. One of the things that attracts me personally is health is a right, and it's available to everyone there. So if we could really open up an avenue of research, it's available to everyone in a country in Europe. So we've really progressed tremendously. We have a team. We've been working with the European Medicines Agency. We have an advice with them on a new research protocol that will be the largest clinical trial for cancer patients in countries across Europe done to date. And the results are truly astonishing of the work that's about to be published, and you'll see that, and I think you've heard it. So this is real science. It's real deep work that's being done by leading institutions like Hopkins, NYU, UCLA, London Imperial, University of Zurich. About 10 new institutions are coming online next year in Europe. So this is real work, and it really needs to be looked at carefully, and I think that's what we're aiming to do, and to build the evidence to bring this into practice and to see how to do it safely. And the last thing I'd comment on is it's been really fascinating to look at the technical sweetness of this problem. That's a very geeky thing to do, a very policy thing to do, but when you look at the types of things that will need to be in place, so far we've done research, it's been about 40 patients a year at Hopkins. That's been the most we've done. If we look at just 0.5% of cancer patients in the UK who would be interested in this treatment, we have to figure out how to do that for 14,000 people. So there are really some very interesting questions of scale, some very interesting questions of policy. How do you regulate a treatment package of therapy and a medicine and not have just the medicine be there? How do you develop safe facilities and train lots of therapists? So there's a really interesting set of issues, and ones that we're finding are greatly compelling to regulators and health officials as they start looking at this early data. So that's...
Thank you, George. That's great. I'm going to want to turn to your questions since we don't have that much time. So while if anyone has questions, please do line up. But I wanted to throw out one to either Bill or George, which is, why psilocybin, of all the psychedelic drugs? Why are we working more on that? What are its advantages?
I love that question. Psilocybin has a number of advantages. First of all, it is not LSD, and it doesn't evoke crazy responses either for pro or con. Psilocybin has a long natural history. It's been used by Indian communities for probably thousands of years. Has a very good safety profile. Psilocybin has a duration of action of 6 hours at the most, where LSD is at least 8 hours, mescaline at maybe 12 hours. It works into the clinical day. It's not unduly exhausting to work with. And I love to say a great advantage of psilocybin is that it's hard to spell. And it just doesn't get the negative press that the other drugs get.
Before I go to the questions, I just wanted to, I'm very curious to get Lynn's take on what she's heard. And specific, we've talked about the ways in which this drug is kind of distinctive in terms of the fact that it has to be part of a package, a psychotherapeutic package, in terms of the fact that it's a single administration. I'm curious to know, as someone who's thought a lot about the pharmacopoeia, what are some of your reactions to what you've heard about it?
From everything that I've heard and everything that I've read, I think everybody in this room is going to line up for a dose, is what I think. It kind of, Dr. Marion, you're here with me. I think it kind of draws a lot of parallel to cannabis for me. And I think we deserve the opportunity to find out where is the best place to niche this product. You know, who is the best patient population? We can't treat 14,000 people a week, so who would best benefit from this? What would be the correct dose, and so forth?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Brett.
The people who were here this morning may recall I made a comment in our panel about person-centered medicine is very important, but really soul-to-soul is the way that many of us are used to working with people who are near the end of life. And I guess my question is, this class of medications clearly has a huge effect on people who are near the end of life. Has there been any discussion about what effect it might have on practitioners to use these drugs to better understand what they're really facing when they deal with patients?
That's a good one for Bill, I think.
Oh, yeah. No question. I'd like to stress that the drugs have application in medicine, in education, and in religion. And the two applications in education that interest me most of all is in the training of mental health providers and in the training of clergy. I thought some primary religious experience might someday be part of seminary education. That may sound radical, but why not? And certainly for people who are dealing with the terminally ill, perhaps family members as well as caregivers, someday this might be a very appropriate intervention.
George, you also have included this in your training protocols, yes?
Yes, I think one of the things that's been really important to us in our discussions with government and how you create the capacity to do this work is how do you actually equip therapists and train therapists and certify therapists, because this will not be done this will be in licensed facilities with a lot of control, at least initially is the model that we've been exploring. And therefore you need to have trained clinicians who are able to work with this. Now, what happens when someone puts those blindfolds on and the headphones and goes inward for 6 hours? And how do you have a therapist understand what that experience is like? So part of our training protocol that we've been working on and are seeking permissions for from different governments right now is actually the development of a training that uses psilocybin in the training of therapists. And this was done routinely in the 50s and 60s, but bringing that back just so that people have a personal experience, which is also critically important for establishing trust in the therapeutic environment. Because if someone is afraid to have had the experience themselves, that doesn't create a good therapeutic bond. So, and that's one of the most important things, is a safe, secure environment.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name's Carl Steinberg. I chair the Coalition for Compassionate Care of California, and I'm just going to preface my comments and questions by saying I haven't had any psychotropic medication or alcohol for almost 25 years. Now, that being said, back in the 70s, I was at Harvard. I took a lot of hallucinogens back in the day. I definitely found that psilocybin, compared to some of the other ones, had more of a sense of well-being, predictable well-being. It also tends to make people laugh a lot. I don't know if that's something that you guys see in your research. But I guess what I'm getting at is I would totally support having my patients have access to this, and even their families, and maybe even some of their doctors and so on. But it seems so labor intensive, right? I mean, it's 3 sessions and then 6 hours and so on. And I just think there's going to be kind of healthcare disparity issues around that. And so I'm wondering, there are already things available that also create a sense of well-being. I mean, there's other hallucinogens with shorter half-lives, right? I mean, you could use DMT or something like that, and then it wouldn't be as long. Still a very profound, experience. But then what about like MDMA? I know they're studying that, that whole sense of well-being and community. And what about something that's already readily available and inexpensive? Like ketamine, right? So I'm just wondering, and maybe Lynn, you might have some insight into that. Thanks.
We use ketamine more for difficult pain syndrome, so perhaps you could take it from here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm open to countless research projects with different drugs and different frameworks. MDMA, popularly known as ecstasy, though all ecstasy does not have MDMA in it, we've learned, is worth. Ecstasy seems to open up kind of the heart area relationships in very profound ways and may be appropriate to explore. But it tends to be different from what we call the major entheogens, or the major psychedelics, which would be LSD, DMT, DPT, DET, psilocybin. And they seem to be basically kind of skeleton keys that give access to the human mind, if you will. So the experiences are better understood not as being in the molecule of the drug, but within human consciousness. And what we're really doing is exploring human consciousness. And we've learned that there are states of consciousness that we can have access to that we would never guess were there, that are just part of the legacy of being human. And it's just a huge frontier we're at, and we're just beginning.
Well, it's got palliative written all over it. Thanks.
Yeah.
I just wanted to do a quick comment that we are, in fact, looking at shorter-acting substances, and I think what's important here, though, is remember this is a regulatory process. It's a long and challenging regulatory process, entering phase 3 now here, or another model in the US, in the Europe. And so this focus right now is on how do we take and build upon the research that has been done to, as quickly as possible, get into patients where you're actually working in the real world rather than in the constraints of a clinical trial protocol. So I think there's a strategy here, but that's a terrific point.
Right. That if psilocybin could become perhaps the first legal psychedelic for trained people to use, that would be a big step forward.